You often hear the word freedom spoken with a kind of reverence, as if it's the ultimate goal of life. The ability to do whatever you want whenever you want without interference. It's the promise of weekends without meetings, relationships without compromise, work without rules. To be free, the world says, is to be unchained. But you begin to sense that this version of freedom, attractive as it sounds, doesn't actually feel like liberation. Instead, it starts to feel like drift, like untethered wandering. And slowly, the things you thought would make you free begin to own you. You binge for relief. You lash out because you can. You scroll until your attention belongs to something else. What began as a desire to be free now looks a lot like being trapped in habits, cravings, fears, and moods you didn't choose and can't quite stop. The Stoics saw this long ago. Seneca warned, to be everywhere is to be nowhere. Freedom without aim, he believed, was distraction dressed as liberty. And Epictetus was even clearer. No man is free who is not master of himself. What if the version of freedom you've inherited, of doing whatever feels good in the moment, isn't freedom at all, but a disguised form of slavery, not to chains or governments, but to your own unexamined impulses? Think of a river. Flowing freely is not the same as flooding aimlessly. When the river has banks, it carves a valley. When it doesn't, it destroys. The same is true of your mind. The desire for boundaryless freedom often ends not in expansion, but in erosion. You lose direction. You lose peace. So now you wonder, what if true freedom isn't about breaking loose, but learning how to stay steady? What if it's not about escaping limits, but choosing them? Could discipline something? Modern life tells you to resist actually be the way in. This is the paradox Stoicism introduces, that the more you govern your impulses, the more you govern your life. That the man who cannot say no is not free, but the man who can is. You're at the beginning of a redefinition, one where freedom no longer means the absence of structure, but the presence of clarity. And discipline, once misunderstood as oppression, begins to emerge as something gentler, steadier, almost like a quiet kind of strength. So you pause, you consider, and you ask yourself, is the freedom I've been chasing truly making me free, or just distracted, restless, and reactive? Because to find lasting peace, you must first understand what kind of freedom is worth seeking. You continue walking through your thoughts, and the idea of freedom still lingers. But now you begin to peel it back slowly, thoughtfully, not to discard it, but to understand it more honestly. The Stoics used a word you don't often hear, eleutheria, a kind of freedom that has nothing to do with outer circumstances and everything to do with your inner state. Unlike modern definitions that prize external autonomy, Stoic freedom is inward. It's not about removing all limits. It's about removing your need to be controlled by what lies outside you. Epictetus, born into slavery, spoke more convincingly about freedom than most men who ruled. Why? Because he understood something essential, that true bondage isn't a chain around your wrist, it's an unchecked reaction, a desire that owns you, or a thought you've never questioned. Is someone else the master of your peace, he would ask. If yes, then you're still enslaved, even if the world calls you free. Imagine standing in the middle of a storm. Wind howls, leaves scatter, but somewhere deep inside, you are still. That's Stoic freedom. Not pretending the storm doesn't exist, but learning how to remain unmoved within it. It's not a fantasy of control, it's clarity about what can be controlled, your thoughts, your judgments, your choices. Everything else, they said, belongs to fate. Marcus Aurelius, ruler of Rome, held supreme power. Yet in his journal, he constantly reminded himself that freedom was not about commanding legions, but mastering himself. You have power over your mind, he wrote. not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength. This is not the loud freedom of rebellion, it's the quiet, disciplined freedom of self-awareness. The Stoics were not indifferent to suffering or injustice, but they drew a line between what happens to you and how you meet it. And in that space, that narrow private space between stimulus and response, they saw the birthplace of all real liberty. Think of a candle in a dark cave. It cannot push back the entire darkness, but it can keep its own light steady. And that is what you are learning to do, to hold your light even when the world shakes around you. So now you ask, what if I stopped chasing control over life and started cultivating control over myself? That is the question Stoicism gently asks again and again, not to shame you, but to free you, because once you stop demanding the world be different and start working with the mind you've been given, you begin to experience something rare and durable peace that does not depend on permission. Freedom then becomes something quieter, more rooted, less a flag to wave and more a posture to live by. You live in a world that constantly tells you to take control. Control your schedule, control your results, control your future. But beneath that shiny promise is a quiet exhaustion. Because the truth is, most things lie beyond your grasp. And deep down, you already know it. You can't control how others speak to you. You can't control what happens in traffic, the economy, or your inbox tomorrow. You can't even always control how you feel the moment you wake up. And so, you try harder, you grasp tighter, you plan, you react, you adjust. But it never seems to be enough. The more you cling to control, the more life seems to slip through your fingers. The Stoics saw this pattern as one of the great traps of human life, mistaking influence for command. They taught that suffering often arises not from events themselves, but from your demand that those events go your way. Epictetus put it sharply, some things are up to us and some are not. And your job, he said, is to learn the difference. You think of trying to control the weather. It sounds foolish until you realize how often you do the same with people, or moods, or outcomes. You wish someone had acted differently. You stress over a future you can't see. You replay a conversation that's already over. But none of these bring peace. They only tighten the grip of what's beyond you. Instead, imagine holding sand in your palm. Squeeze and it spills away. But if you open your hand, the sand settles. This is what the Stoics meant by surrender, not giving up, but letting go of your demand that the world obey your will. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself daily, you have to assemble your life yourself, action by action, and be satisfied if each one achieves its goal as far as possible. He didn't expect perfection. He didn't cling to outcomes. He simply acted, adjusted, and released. That was his quiet power. You begin to see that true strength lies not in trying to dominate life, but in cooperating with it. Not passively, but wisely. You still move forward. You still choose. But you stop mistaking effort for omnipotence. So you ask, what if I stopped resisting uncertainty and learned to live with it more skillfully, like a sailor reading the wind rather than cursing it? The more you practice this, the more you begin to feel something unexpected: ease. Not the ease of laziness, but of alignment. The ease that comes when you stop wrestling the river and learn to steer with the current. Control then becomes less about force and more about flow. You no longer need everything to go your way. You simply need to know your way through it. You begin to notice how much of your inner life revolves around wanting often without you even realizing it. You want comfort, praise, certainty, success. You want more ease and less friction, more affirmation, fewer delays. It's natural, but unexamined desire can quietly take over your days, steering your thoughts, your choices, your peace. The Stoics called this the first discipline, the discipline of desire. To them, the problem was not in wanting itself, but in wanting what lies beyond your control. When you crave what fate may or may not give you hand over your freedom, you put your peace on layaway, always waiting for the next condition to be met. Epictetus warned, freedom is not achieved by satisfying desire, but by eliminating it. Not all desire, but the kind that makes your well-being hostage to chance. You reflect on this. How often have you chased something only to feel emptier once you reached it? How many moments have you missed because you were staring at a future you hoped would finally complete you? It's like drinking salt water. The more you consume, the thirstier you become. Instead, the Stoics taught a radical shift: desire only what depends on you. That is desire to act well, to respond wisely, to think clearly, because those are the only desires the world cannot block. Think of a mountain climber. If their only wish is to reach the summit, then storms, injuries, or bad luck can ruin the journey. But if they value each step, each breath, each decision along the way, then even failure becomes a path to strength. The summit is no longer the measure. The climb itself is the reward. This doesn't mean you stop setting goals. It means your peace no longer depends on them. You can pursue love, success, or security, but not need them to be whole. You begin to separate effort from outcome and want less from the world than you do from yourself. Desire, when properly disciplined, becomes quieter, deeper. You no longer grasp at every craving. You start to ask, is this something I truly need, or just something I've learned to chase? That's a powerful pause. And within it lies freedom, not the kind that screams, I can have whatever I want, but the kind that calmly says, I already have what I need to be whole. You're not escaping life's pleasures, you're simply no longer ruled by them. And in that self-governance, you begin to taste something rare and steady, a kind of internal dignity, a form of joy that does not shout, but hums. This is where discipline stops feeling like punishment and starts feeling like peace. Now you turn inward to the second Stoic pillar, the discipline of action. It's not just about what you feel or even what you want, but what you actually do. Because without disciplined action, philosophy becomes decoration. Beautiful words, but no movement. In your daily life, you're constantly making choices: what to say, how to respond, when to show up, when to walk away. But if you aren't aware, those choices begin to run on autopilot. You act out of habit, emotion, convenience. Soon, your day is not something you live, but something that happens to you. The Stoics saw action as sacred, not because you must always be busy, but because every action is a reflection of your character. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "Waste no more time arguing about what a good man should be. Be one." It's a reminder that life doesn't wait for your perfect mood. It calls for movement, often quiet, often simple, but always aligned with your principles. You think of a craftsman at their bench. Each cut, each motion is deliberate, not rushed, not hesitant. That's what Stoic action looks like, not frantic hustle, but steady intentionality. You don't just act because you feel like it. You act because it's right. This discipline invites you to ask two questions before any decision. Is this up to me? And if so, what's the most virtuous choice I can make? You stop asking whether something is easy or rewarding. Instead, you ask if it's just courageous, temperate, or wise. These four cardinal virtues, justice, courage, temperance, wisdom, become your compass. It's not about grand gestures, it's about showing up for your life as it actually is. Washing the dishes with care, apologizing when you're wrong, starting the task you've been avoiding, saying no when yes would compromise your integrity. Stoic action is built from these small, honest moments. You begin to notice that action becomes less draining when it flows from clarity. You're no longer acting for applause or outcomes or approval. You're acting because it's in line with the kind of person you're training yourself to be. A storm may swirl around you, but your actions, however small, can remain your own. And that's powerful. In a world obsessed with results, you are learning to value rightness over recognition. So now you ask yourself, what kind of person am I becoming through the actions I take today? Even when no one is watching, the more you ask, the more your choices align with your values. And from that alignment comes a quiet confidence, not loud, not boastful, but deeply rooted, because you're not waiting to be free someday. You're choosing your freedom with every step you take today. Now you arrive at the third and perhaps most subtle form of discipline, the discipline of assent. It begins where every experience begins, not in the world, but in your mind. Something happens and instantly thoughts rush in. This is bad. This isn't fair. I can't handle this. But what if the event itself is neutral? And it's your judgment, your assent to a certain interpretation that shapes how you suffer or endure. The Stoics taught that your thoughts are not facts. They are proposals, and you are free to accept or decline each one. This is the power of assent. It's the moment between stimulus and response, the quiet pause where freedom either begins or vanishes. As Epictetus said, it's not things themselves that disturb us, but our opinions about them. This insight is simple but transformative. Your distress is not caused by the world. It's caused by the meaning you attach to it. You imagine standing at a train station. A train of thought arrives, loud, emotional, convincing. You feel the pull to hop on, but you don't have to. You can watch it pass. Not every thought deserves a ticket to ride in your mind. This doesn't mean suppressing emotion or pretending to be unaffected. It means learning to separate the raw experience from your automatic story about it. It's not my boss hates me, it's my boss gave feedback. It's not everything is ruined, it's something unexpected happened. Language matters, judgment matters, because how you describe your life to yourself becomes how you live it. Marcus Aurelius practiced this constantly. In his meditations, he wrote, "If you are pained by external things, it is not they that disturb you, but your own judgment of them. And it is in your power to wipe out that judgment now." These were not lofty words. This was his shield in chaos. A man facing war, illness, betrayal, and death, choosing not to hand his peace over to events. You begin to see that assent is not weakness, it's clarity, it's discernment. When you catch yourself spiraling into frustration, fear, or jealousy, you pause. You ask, is this thought useful? Is it true? Is it helping me live wisely or merely react emotionally? You won't catch every thought. You won't stop every story. But even noticing that you have a choice changes everything. It means you're no longer a puppet to your own mind, you're becoming its guide. This is where inner freedom lives, in the ability to let a thought knock and not always open the door. And so the more you practice the discipline of assent, the less power the world has over your moods. You become a gatekeeper of your own peace. And while the world may not change, your experience of it begins to. You've likely been taught to avoid resistance. If something feels hard, heavy, or uncomfortable, the instinct is to retreat. But the Stoics invite you to look again, to consider that resistance is not always an enemy. Sometimes it's a guide, a quiet teacher in disguise. You begin to notice how much of your inner growth has come through difficulty, not around it. That moment you chose to speak honestly when it would have been easier to stay silent. The day you stayed with the pain instead of distracting yourself. The evening you kept going even when doubt crept in. The Stoics believed resistance was not only inevitable, it was essential. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way." This isn't just a clever phrase, it's a blueprint for resilience. It means the obstacle isn't just something to endure, it's something to work with. Think of a tree growing on a rocky cliff. The roots don't curse the stone, they grow around it, through it. They become stronger because of it. The resistance shapes them. It's not a flaw, it's part of the path. In your own life, resistance shows up in different forms: fatigue, rejection, temptation, delay. It whispers, "This is too much, you're not ready, it's not worth it." But if you lean in gently, intentionally, you begin to see that resistance is the pressure under which strength is forged. Epictetus said, "Difficulties are things that show a person what they are." When you feel resistance, you can ask, what does this reveal about me? Where am I rigid? Where am I reactive? Where do I still need to grow? The key isn't to power through blindly, it's to pause and reflect, to meet the resistance not as a wall, but as a mirror. Sometimes the lesson is to persevere. Sometimes it's to surrender. Sometimes it's to pivot. But in every case, resistance becomes a teacher, one that's honest, if not always gentle. You start to ask yourself, what if the very things I'm resisting are here to refine me, not punish me? That question reframes everything. A long delay becomes a chance to develop patience. A difficult conversation becomes a chance to practice courage. A temptation becomes a chance to exercise restraint. In each moment you are being shaped not by ease, but by how you face the lack of it. And so the more you welcome resistance as a part of your training, the more grounded you feel. Not invincible, but willing. Not hardened, but prepared. You are no longer just enduring life, you're engaging with it. Eyes open, posture steady, and that the Stoics would say is the beginning of true freedom. Not in avoiding discomfort, but in learning how to walk with it. You now begin to realize that lasting freedom doesn't arise from a single insight. It grows from small, consistent effort. That's why the Stoics weren't just thinkers. They were practitioners. They believed in daily disciplines not out of rigidity, but out of care. Because the mind, like the body, must be trained. You've seen how easily the day can sweep you away. A small distraction becomes an hour lost. A single comment throws off your mood. One missed intention, and suddenly the day feels like it owns you. That's why Stoicism grounds itself in practices anchors for the mind. You don't wait until chaos comes to build stability. You build it beforehand. Marcus Aurelius wrote in his journal every morning, not to entertain, but to remind himself of who he wanted to be. His meditations were not a book, they were a mirror. Each entry a quiet sharpening of his inner compass. He would remind himself, you could leave life right now. Let that determine what you do and say and think. It was not morbid, it was clarifying. You begin to adopt this approach. Perhaps you rise and write a few lines about what you fear or hope for, or how you want to respond to the challenges ahead. This isn't about performance, it's about intention, about meeting the day with eyes open rather than reacting blindly. Or maybe before sleep you look back on the hours you've lived. You ask, did I act with integrity? Was I kind even when I didn't feel like it? Where did I fall short, not with shame, but with curiosity? These small reflections create something powerful: self-awareness, without self-punishment. You are not trying to be perfect, you are trying to be conscious, to live, as Seneca said, as if under constant inspection, not by others, but by the wiser part of yourself. And beyond journaling, you find other practices: silence before speaking, a pause before reacting, a slow breath before deciding, rehearsing adversity not out of pessimism but preparation. The Stoics called this premeditatio malorum, imagining what could go wrong, not to worry, but to build readiness. You picture your flight being delayed, a friend disappointing you, a plan falling through, and then you ask, if this happens, how will I respond? It's not a rigid script, it's a soft rehearsal. a way of reminding yourself, I can face life as it is not just as I wish it to be. So you ask, what small daily ritual would help me stay anchored in who I want to be? Because when the storms come, and they will, it's not theory that steadies you, it's practice. And when done consistently, these small acts become more than habits. They become your character, woven into how you move, speak, and respond. You don't need to do it perfectly. You just need to show up, not for the world, but for yourself. You've explored freedom in thought, in action, and in desire. But now you turn to something more delicate, freedom in how you relate to others. Because for all your internal strength, it's in your relationships, where discipline is most often tested. You know this feeling: someone offends you, disrespects you, misunderstands you, and the reaction is almost immediate: anger, withdrawal, sarcasm, defensiveness. These are the habits you fall into when you feel threatened. And yet, strangely, reacting in these ways doesn't make you feel more powerful. It often leaves you feeling less free. The Stoics knew that true discipline shows itself in how you respond to other people's behavior, not just your own moods. As Epictetus said, it is not he who insults you that harms you, but your opinion that you are insulted. It's not about pretending to be above pain. It's about seeing clearly where pain actually comes from, not from the event, but from your interpretation of it. You begin to understand that relationships are not arenas for control, but for practice. Each conversation becomes a field where your discipline is tested. Can you listen without needing to win? Can you speak without needing to hurt? Can you love without needing to possess? Think of a fire. When fed too much, it rages. When deprived completely, it dies. But tended with care, it gives warmth. Your relationships are the same. Without discipline, they burn or fade. With the right balance of honesty, restraint, and attention, they become a steady source of meaning. Marcus Aurelius often reminded himself that difficult people are part of life. When you wake up in the morning, he wrote, tell yourself the people I deal with today will be meddling, ungrateful, arrogant, dishonest, jealous, and surly. This wasn't pessimism, it was preparation. He understood that your peace can't depend on others behaving perfectly. You begin to shift your question. Instead of, why are they like this? You ask, how do I want to be, even when they are like this? That question frees you. You stop trying to edit everyone else's behavior. You focus instead on your own principles, patience, humility, clarity, and boundaries. This doesn't mean tolerating abuse. The Stoics weren't doormats, but they believed that you can remain rooted in your values without needing to control the outcome. You can walk away from someone with calm, not contempt. You can disagree without escalating. You can forgive not because it's deserved, but because you deserve peace. You realize that the person who can remain kind without being naive, firm without being cruel, and honest without being harsh, is not weak. They are free, because nothing outside them dictates how they behave. And so you ask, how can I make my relationships a reflection of my values, not my wounds? In that question, you find space to pause, to choose, to become someone who brings clarity instead of confusion, calm instead of chaos, someone who even in conflict still feels aligned inside. At last you come to the heart of it all, freedom not as a condition you wait for, but as a presence you carry wherever you go. It's tempting to believe freedom depends on circumstances, that once your schedule clears or your job changes or your relationships improve, then you'll finally feel free. But the Stoics remind you that kind of freedom is fragile. It can be taken. It is never truly yours. Real freedom, they say, is internal. It's not something you acquire. It's something you realize often in the most constrained of places. Epictetus was a slave. Marcus Aurelius was an emperor burdened with wars and betrayals. Yet both spoke of the same liberation, the freedom to choose your response, to hold your center, to live by principle rather than by impulse. You imagine a bird in a cage and another in a storm. One is physically confined but calm, the other untethered but panicked. Who is more free? The Stoics would say the one who governs themselves. You begin to recognize that so much of life is beyond your choosing. Illness comes, people leave, outcomes shift. But within every moment, even the hardest, you still have this sacred space, the ability to shape your perspective, to act with virtue, to align with something deeper than circumstance. This doesn't mean becoming numb. It means becoming resilient. It means facing what is real without abandoning what is essential. As Marcus Aurelius wrote, "A blazing fire makes flame and brightness out of everything that is thrown into it." That's the power you carry, the ability to take even hardship and turn it into fuel. This is why the Stoics didn't pray for comfort, they prayed for strength. Not for life to be easy, but for their character to be equal to life's weight. You begin to see why, because the world will always shift. But your response, that's your domain, that's your freedom. So now, instead of asking, when will things get easier, you ask, how can I meet this moment with steadiness, regardless of what it brings? That question brings you home to yourself. It doesn't erase the struggle, it simply gives you something stronger to stand on. You become less reactive, more intentional, less hurried, more aware. You stop being a victim of events and become a steward of your mind. And this is the freedom the Stoics offer you, not the escape from life's weight, but the strength to carry it with grace. A freedom that no loss, no law, no person can take from you because it lives within. You don't need to wait for the perfect moment to be free. You simply need to begin now with your next thought, your next word, your next choice. Because when discipline becomes your anchor, freedom becomes your natural state. And now, as you reach the end of this journey, you begin to feel what the Stoics meant all along. Freedom was never about breaking away from the world. It was about breaking away from the need to be ruled by it. You've walked through the disciplines of desire, action, and thought, not as rules, but as reminders. You've learned that your peace does not have to wait for perfect circumstances. It can be practiced, sharpened, protected. You realize now that discipline is not a cage. It is a container. It holds your clarity. It preserves your power. It gives shape to your days in a world that wants to pull you in every direction. Like a river guided by its banks, your energy flows, not in chaos, but in direction. The Stoics did not ask you to be cold. They asked you to be calm. They did not demand detachment. They taught presence. They did not seek control of everything, only mastery of the one thing that truly matters, yourself. And this is what you've been building all along. Not armor, but alignment. Not perfection, but presence. Not domination, but dignity. So now you take a breath, not to escape, but to re-enter the world with new eyes. Because freedom isn't something you chase. It's something you practice. And with each moment of intention, each thought you question, each emotion you welcome without worship, you are becoming free. Not someday, now.